Next up, we have Christopher Bennett. Chris is an entrepreneur and an addiction professional who has devoted his life to helping those suffering from substance abuse and co-occurring mental health disorders. In long-term recovery since his early 20s, Chris's ability to relate to, connect with, and empathize with clients and their families is invaluable. Chris is the founder of Chris Bennett Interventions and Chris Burrow Foundation and Encore Recovery Solutions, a variety of behavioral health treatment companies, both private and nonprofit, striving to improve mental health and wellness across the U.S.
Hello, everyone. I gotta say, it's pretty amazing to stand up here on a stage with such powerful and courageous people. Yes, long before I owned companies and ran treatment centers, I was just another kid, just like everyone else, pretty much completely terrified of the world itself and what the world held. I grew up in Northern Virginia in a very normal family for the most part, mom and dad around, both educated, both supportive, took care of me and my sister very well. And from a very young age, I can remember, as far back as I can remember, I never felt comfortable in my own skin. And what I've come to learn over the years is that was really a combination of anxiety and general anxiety around most every situation that I ran into, as well as ADHD. I had a very, very tough time in traditional classrooms and academic environments growing up. So although I could do very well academically, I struggle with a lot of things like they like to call self-control and being a good classmate and a lot of these other things. And what happened to me was as a result of feeling this way for so long, as you know, we've heard so far this evening, I had to cope some way with the way I felt. And being a professional and for nearly a decade working in behavioral health care and addictive disorders, what we find is that people deal with the way that they feel on a spectrum, and some are positive ways and some are not so positive. And we are all, as human beings, going to deal with pain, and we're going to do that in a variety of different ways. And the way I dealt with pain from what I was experiencing in the world is I turned to substance use. And so by the time I got to high school, I had already begun experimentation with smoking weed, drinking. Very quickly that began to transpire into more dangerous types of drugs like cocaine and benzodiazepines like Xanax. And eventually where all of this led me was a really strong downward spiral into opiate addiction and heroin use. And so I went from a talented athlete, an excellent student, and a great family, in a great part of Northern Virginia, to being a poster child for basically what you don't want your kid to look like, at least on the outside. My parents were ostracized in a lot of our community we grew up in because they must have been absolutely terrible parents, because I was obviously a reflection upon them. And I think that's what we see a lot today, is that parents all too often are looked at and said, well, what did the parents do wrong? And I think that's at least a lot of the communities I work with in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, the struggle families have being able to reach out for support is because of the stigma that comes along with mental health and substance use. And you know, my parents, I was lucky enough to have parents who tried everything they possibly could to help me. They sent me to treatment centers, to military schools, to treatment programs, outpatient, inpatient, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, all this. And they really did everything they possibly could to help me. And I know we're here tonight not only with an audience full of young people, but also parents. And I think a lot of my message to parents is really that what's going on with your children potentially needs to be talked about. There's the need for support with the families. And I think the one way we can do that is by the community really coming together and supporting each other in that. So I stand here proudly today saying I've lived with mental illness for 32 years. I don't discriminate between a substance use disorder and anxiety, for example. It's all a mental illness. And so what happened to me is similar to some of the stories that we've heard this evening. I became so hopeless and helpless with the ability to control my use of drugs that I finally had to reach out for help. I had been suicidal for many years, and the way that I used substances was to medicate the way that I felt. And so, although I could have turned to some more healthy coping strategies at those times in my life, I was fairly incapable of doing so. And so I turned to some people. I got the help that I needed, not only from friends, from family, but the community, and I was able to get sober. And the interesting thing is, getting sober is the very beginning, because we talk about I was using drugs for a reason, and so a lot of times the problems start when the people stop using drugs. And I tell families and young people all the time, drugs aren't really the problem; they're actually the solution to the way that someone's feeling. And so when you remove that solution, how do you replace it? So, a lot of my story is learning to cope and to live with ongoing anxiety. It's to learn to live with the fact that I don't operate very well in traditional type of academic settings. And so I actually never did very well in school because I actually just couldn't go to class and I couldn't focus in class. And now even today, people laugh at me at the office because I have boxes of fidget toys everywhere, and I play with things all day long and in meetings, and people can't understand how I can focus and still play or listen to music and do a lot of these things that have actually really helped me to be successful today. And I think, the pain we go through as human beings, and especially as young people, all too often is not talked about. And that's why I'm so honored to be a part of what This Is Brave is bringing to the table this evening, which is the idea that we can be conversation starters, that we can all, no matter where we are in life, no matter who we are, we can come together and have a conversation about mental illness. And I think that I had some conversations earlier today with some of these folks that, 15 years ago when I was in high school, there weren't things like this going on. There weren't support groups at school. There weren't the resources available like they are today. And I feel absolutely honored and blessed to be a part of opening and having these conversations in communities across the country, and really, really helping to push everyone, who's sitting here today, that, if you are in a position of struggling, that if you know someone who's in a position of struggling, that reaching out and asking for help is not something weak to do. And I think all too often as well, from the way that males are raised, a lot of times we think we can't reach out, we can't show emotion, we can't cry, we can't do a lot of these things because it's not manly. And I think on the flip side, what it really shows is I just think it shows a lot of strength and a lot of courage that we can be true to who we are. And so I'm honored to be here this evening, and thank you to everyone else who's been here, and thanks again, Jen, and This Is My Brave. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.